I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Alex Weston. Alex and I have had a history of doing programs together, and I'm thrilled to have him part of this series. He's worked for the Minnesota Historical Society since 2005 at a variety of sites, including historic Fort Snelling and the Mill City Museum, and he's currently a program associate at the James J. Hill House and the Alexander Ramsey House. He holds a bachelor's in history from the Metro State University and currently lives in St. Paul with his wife and 3 children. Let's give Alex a warm welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Akoma, and thank you, everyone, for braving the wild traffic and parking and the weather and everything else. I'm so thrilled to see people in seats. So thank you for coming out. So when I was a kid, one of the things, and I'll date myself a little bit by this, but one of the things that first got me really interested in history, specifically local history, was a TPT documentary called Lost Twin Cities, based on the book by Larry Millett. And this documentary went through, it's a good book, good documentary, actually there's a whole series of them, but it went through a bunch of buildings and parks and things that used to be in the Twin Cities but got torn down. And as a kid, that blew my mind. It was, I grew up in Minneapolis, so thinking that there was kind of this whole alternative landscape that once existed got me very passionate about wanting to learn more. Well, today's presentation is going to be similar but a little different. We're going to be not talking about buildings that once were here that got torn down, but buildings that someone suggested could be here but never actually happened. And in fact, not just buildings, but bridges and monorails and all sorts of other fun things. So in a way, this is an alternate history. If you're fans of Harry Turtledove or Philip K. Dick or any of those sort of, what if this historical event had gone different, each of these things that I'll be presenting on offers an opportunity to think about an alternate path that for one reason or another, often for a very good reason, but for one reason or another was not taken. And a thing I love about alternate histories is it's actually a different way of shining light on what did happen. Because one of the things we struggle with when trying to understand history, and especially trying to teach history, a fancy word they taught me in college is called teleological thinking. Basically, we're looking backward. We know how the story ended. There's no spoiler alerts in history. We know where things ended up. And the risk you have is it always feels like the way things ended up happening was inevitable. That's the way they just always were going to happen. And one thing as a historian I always try to do is put back agency into the people who are making decisions, put back contingency, realize things always could go a different way. Even if there's powerful reasons why things did happen one way or another, there's always alternatives, there's always slight variations, there's always alternate timelines to be explored. I also love Back to the Future too, for the same reason. So think of each of the things that I'll be talking about in this presentation as sort of a potential departure point, and just, I'll leave you to imagine how would things have been different here in the Twin Cities if this or that decision had actually come to fruition. Now, just as a quick poll, how many of you are from the Twin Cities area or live in the metro or have lived in the metro? Okay, good, that's most of you. So the rest of you might be very confused at parts of this because I'll make a lot of reference to local things. I'll try to keep it accessible. One thing I would say, even if you're not from the Twin Cities, the kind of story I'm sharing here is really a story similar to what happened in every city, because every city is the result of planning choices that were made by someone at some point. They occur in a larger context of the culture and the historical moment at that time. And a lot of things that were happening in the Twin Cities have parallels around the country and even around the world. And on that note, before we really dive into it, I have to say just a little note about cities. Urban planners sometimes like to make a distinction between quote unquote organic cities and planned cities. Now, the distinction is more theoretical than practical, but to understand the idea, an organic city wasn't necessarily planned all together as one big thing. It just kind of grew up haphazardly, bit by bit, however seemed best at the time. There was no overarching system by which the roadways would be laid out or numbered or named. There was no, zoning telling what types of buildings go where. Things just sort of grew up the way they grew up. And I have here a picture of London in the 17th century. It's a city that's been around since Roman times, classic organic city, and the streets are crazy to this day. Although, again, there's no purely organic city because, of course, there's still planning happening. There's still major public works efforts. And in particular, in the case of a lot of cities, including London, old cities have often burned down multiple times, and that's definitely the case with London. So, for example, there's a huge fire in the 1660s. That's a sort of chance to rebuild and clean things up a little bit. So even the quote-unquote organic cities, there is some planning, but they are in contrast to a city like Washington, D.C. This is the original plan by Pierre L'Enfant, made in 1791 for Washington, D.C. There was no city here when he made this plan. It was just a bunch of sort of prairie and swamp and scrubland. And, you see how neat and orderly these streets are compared to this mess. And that's the difference between a planned city and a organic city. Now, of course, this is the plan. When they actually started building DC, they didn't quite follow the plan all the time. They mixed things up. DC has an organic element to it as well. So again, this distinction between planned cities and organic cities, in the real world, it's more of a spectrum than a sharp dichotomy. But I will say, in my life, I grew up in Minneapolis, but I've spent all my adult life in St. Paul, and I know that there's a healthy and friendly rivalry between the two cities. I've spent enough time in both that I'm agnostic on that. I love them both. I consider myself a sort of dual citizen. But before I moved to St. Paul, growing up in Minneapolis, the thing that we always liked to hold over St. Paul was, your streets don't make any sense. In Minneapolis, you know where things are. If someone says, I live at 4216 DuPont, I know that you live on DuPont, which is right next to, in the letter of alphabets, I know what direction your house is facing. I know you're near 42nd Street. All of that just from an address. In St. Paul, addresses mean nothing. And, this could be considered a sort of example of Minneapolis being more of a planned city and St. Paul being more of an organic city. Now, growing up, I was always told, yes, in Minneapolis, they had this amazing plan from the beginning. Before anybody built anything, they laid out the roads. There would be avenues going one way, streets going another way. Streets are numbered. Avenues are going to be alphabetical. It's all going to be beautiful. That wasn't actually quite the case. Early Minneapolis included St. Anthony across the river, which the two cities combined in 1872. Early Minneapolis was pretty organic. This is the first sort of plat of Minneapolis and St. Anthony, drawn by a guy named George Christmas at the behest of Colonel John H. Stevens, completed in 1856. And the city never looked even this orderly in 1856. Most of those roads are theoretical. There's really only a couple roads. Most of them don't have names in this early day. People were just kind of putting buildings wherever. This was sort of the first attempt to plan Minneapolis, and they start to divide things into, let's see, do I have an arrow? There we do. You can see there's basically a series of grids here. Well, I can see on my screen too. I don't know why I keep looking there. So there's a series of grids, and they're all facing the river, and so the river curves, and so the grids change orientation, and then where one grid runs into another, you get these funky triangle-shaped blocks. That's the way New Orleans was laid out in the 1500s, and since then, pretty much every town in North America thought that's a pretty good way to lay things out, especially if you're on a river. So this is standard 19th century urban planning. St. Paul's the same way. The difference between Minneapolis and St. Paul is that at a certain point, by the 1860s, they said, okay, once we get away from the river, let's shift the streets so they're all running north, south, east, west, and then we'll have a grid. St. Paul eventually kind of did that too, but more of St. Paul is kind of in this hilly river valley area. So St. Paul is still this sort of mishmash of differing sized grids. That being said, Minneapolis's names did not make sense in the early days. Let me find my cursor here. Nope. No. Sorry, they made me use a computer that's not my computer, and I'm suddenly floundering. How do I... Oop. No. Well, you just got a preview. Let's try this. Can't see my notes, and then you really don't want me just going off the cuff, because then I'll talk for 5 hours. All right, there we go. So at first, things were just sort of named whatever. Like the main street was the main street, and the other streets didn't need names. It was like, that's where John's Butcher Shop is. That's where the sawmill is. That you don't need names when the town is small and everyone's new. But as they start naming things, they name things after some of the early European American settlers. They name things after trees. Trees are really popular. Flowers, presidents, but all of the early names, the ones that you would see if you could zoom in on that map, they're all different than today. There's only one avenue that we'd recognize, and that is Hennepin Avenue, is already called Hennepin at this point. But for example, in just this little map, this is just downtown, there are 6 different Oak Streets. And the numbering is just whatever. Like you could have on one block, you'd have, going from 8 to 80, and then on the next block it starts at 500 and goes to 600, because each little developer who owned these plots of land would just number things however they felt made sense in their little plot. And this is how St. Paul was too. This is how early cities were. So one of the first sort of big planning decisions that the founders of Minneapolis had to make was relatively early on, they decided to clean up the names of the roads. So in 1873, after several meticulous months of planning, the City Council elected to change the names of most of the streets and also alter the layout to make it more navigable. This is when we get that plan. So it wasn't quite from the beginning, but it's pretty early on. And everybody hated it at first. Everyone complained and whined, I don't know where I live. I used to be on Oak Street, and now I'm on, what is this, Washington Avenue? But they got used to it eventually, and this 1873 is where you get this idea that if it's running north-south, it'll be called an avenue. East-west, it's going to be called a street. Directional designations are given based on their relation to the river and Hennepin or Central Avenue. The western side of Minneapolis decided to have the avenues all be alphabetical, and in Northeast, they started naming them after presidents in the order that those presidents served. So it's a nice little history lesson. So that is where Minneapolis gets its nice orderly streets. St. Paul, around 1900, also renamed its streets and fixed the numbering, but picked a system that's a little harder to understand and is not quite as orderly as Minneapolis. So that is definitely still a difference. Again, I love both cities. I love the quirkiness of St. Paul. It's like a fun maze. But Minneapolis is certainly more accessible to outsiders. Now, on the subject of names, I want to just take a quick, brief digression because I'm going to be mostly talking about planning choices like whether to build a railroad or not, whether to build a huge apartment complex, things that are, physically built and have a real tangible effect on people's lives. But another part of urban planning is naming stuff. And while it might not have as direct an effect on people as, where a highway goes, names still matter. They're powerful symbols, they're powerful signifiers, and I could do a whole nother presentation just on the long history of arguments over names, because every single name in this city and in Minneapolis has been argued over, and there have been a lot of name changes and multiple names. Sort of most infamously, a lake that to the Dakota went by several names. It was known, among other things, as Lake Mendoza, which means Lake of the Loon. It was known as Heata Bede, meaning the setback lake, and perhaps most commonly Bede Makaska, Lake White Earth. When European Americans arrived, the first ones around here were from Fort Snelling, and they named it after the Secretary of War at the time, John C. Calhoun. Calhoun would go on to be one of slavery's chief apologists, arguing not only that it's not bad, but in fact a positive good, and he becomes one of the first to really lay out an argument that the southern states should secede if the northern states aren't going to allow slavery everywhere, really paving the way for the Civil War. So in 1861, when 20,000 Minnesota soldiers volunteered to fight to keep the Union together, as early as 1861, people were saying, maybe we should change the name of Lake Calhoun. Calhoun was already not a popular guy in Minneapolis. And what's weird is the Pioneer Press, which was a Democrat, Southern sympathizing leaning paper at the time, the Pioneer Press printed this story that said, everyone's got it wrong. It wasn't named after that Calhoun. It was named after a Lieutenant James Calhoun who was here at Fort Snelling in the 1820s. Calm down, everyone. Everyone went, okay. Now, the problem with that is there never was a Lieutenant James Calhoun. They completely made this up. And we know this, it's very hard to prove a negative, but one thing that's great about the Army, they keep great records. And we know the name of every single person who ever served at Fort Snelling, no Calhouns. But it kept the name from being controversial until at least the 1890s. And by the 1890s, an organization called the Grand Army of the Republic, which is like the VFW, but specifically for Union soldiers who'd fought in the Civil War, they're erecting monuments to the great accomplishment of the Union victory and abolishing human slavery. And already they're like, can we change this damn lake? I don't want to celebrate Calhoun. And they're like, yes, even though it's named after another Calhoun, it's close enough, we should change it. And so there's a healthy public discussion. And in 1890, the park board votes to change it to Lake Mendoza, which is their version of the Dakota term meaning Lake of the Loon. And immediately there's a jurisdiction battle between who actually has the right to name this lake or rename it. Sound familiar? And a few maps are printed with this new name, but basically courts strike it down and the name never actually officially changes, and it remains Calhoun until 2017, when the park board votes again to change it, this time to Bde-Maka-Ska. And then there's 3 years of court battles over who has whether it's the DNR or whether it's the state or whether it's the county or whether it's the city or whether it's the park board. In 2020, the Minnesota Supreme Court ruled that yes, the park board can change the name. It is now officially Bde-Maka-Ska. That's the name that I'll use when I refer to it, except when I'm reading primary sources. Anyway, I just wanted to take that brief digression because names are a whole other history, but we'll set names aside. But names of everything in the cities have changed. This is just one example. Now, on the subject of lakes, Minneapolis has a lot of them. It's one of the things people have noticed from early on. And early on, people were trying to think, how do we take advantage of this? Because let's face it, cities in the 19th century, they are business propositions. Businessmen moved out here to try to make money in every way possible. And basically the reason the Twin Cities are here, the reason we have two cities, is because of the unique geography of the rivers. There's this kind of bend here, and then around the bend, going north, there's a waterfall, named in 1680 by a Jesuit priest, the Falls of St. Anthony. Now that waterfall was a business opportunity. That meant you could use it to power machinery. But all along here, there were rocks and rapids in the 19th century. You could not get boats past this junction with what we now call the Minnesota River and the Mississippi River. So this is the best spot to land boats. So the two cities grew up, one around the falls, that's St. Anthony and Minneapolis, eventually just Minneapolis, and then St. Paul grew up right around the bend in the river where it was easy to land boats. So you've got transportation and industry, but already people are thinking, wouldn't it be easier if we could just send boats down the river? And this is before railroads eventually connected St. Paul and Minneapolis. The first railroad in 1861 is just a little 7-mile strip between the two downtowns. But already there's talk of dredging up the sandbars and the islands and rapids and putting in a lock-in dam. But that, some people thought, would not be as easy as making a canal. Now, it was a stupid idea and it was never going to work because there's massive elevation differences. But as early as the 1850s, people were toying with the idea of what if there were canals connecting the lakes? And this nickname that the papers said, Minneapolis could become the Venice of the North. And that just sort of stuck around as one of those ideas that refused to die. And near as I can tell, there weren't many formal plans to do this, because as soon as anyone started actually looking into it, they realized it's a bad idea. This kind of thing, never going to happen in Minneapolis. But people thought it would be really cool if it did. Now, okay, Venice of the North, it's a colorful nickname, but actually early on they're probably thinking more like the Erie Canal of the North. They're thinking, commercial shipping lanes. But the first time that I think this sort of formally starts to get planned that I could find evidence of, in the early building of streetcar systems, there were several competing streetcar companies. Now, these are horse-drawn streetcars, but because they ride on rails, it's still more efficient than just horses and wagon. But in 1879, the Minnesota legislature passes Special Law 193, which gives the Lyndale Railway Company right-of-way all through what's now South Minneapolis. And Section 2 stated in part, the Lyndale Railway Company, its successors and assigns are hereby authorized and empowered to construct a canal by the nearest practicable route to connect the waters of Lake Calhoun and Lake Harriet aforesaid. And then it goes on and on about the canal can be this wide, and it can have steamboats, and it can have horse-pulled barges, and it can have this and that, and they can build lock and dams if they need it because there's elevation differences. And the Lyndale Railway Company seems to have really investigated this before deciding, like everyone else who investigates this idea, that it's just not going to work or worth it. But the idea hung around. And especially on slow news days when newspapers needed something to print, they would have, opinion pieces on, wouldn't it be great if we could truly live up to our promise of being Venice of the North? They use that word promise over and over again. People in Minneapolis early on were apparently expecting a Venice of the North. And there's sort of proposals, and I don't think these were ever too serious, but people are suggesting we could dig a series of canals and have hot water pipes. There'll be a central steam plant that will pump hot water pipes so that the canals don't freeze. Because, of course, one of the main differences between us and Venice is it gets cold here. And this is why not only do we have elevation differences, so there's that to figure out, but things are going to freeze in the winter. So why do we need canals? Because it'd be cool, that's why. But the idea is that they imagined this whole city with these steam-heated canals through the winter, and it would have been really novel. Necessary? No. Interesting? Yeah. But they also, to tackle the elevation differences, there were proposals for locks and dams, which is the usual way you do this. Then there was a really interesting proposal that I wish would have happened, because I think it would have invented the log flume ride several decades before they invented that at amusement parks. The proposal was that you would keep the elevation differences, but you'd have, little waterfalls, and if you're going down, you just ride down the ramp, whee! And then if you're going up, there would be a chain that ratchets to the boat and pulls you up, just like the log flume ride. And combine that with steam-heated canals, and I think we could have had something, but it was not to be. Now, Theodore Wirth, who becomes head of the parks in 1907, he does look into this. The park board, in fact, commands him to look into building canals. He decides, you know what, Calhoun, or as it was called then, Bde-Maka-Ska, and Lake of the Isles and Cedar Lake are close enough in elevation. There were about 3 feet in elevation difference between the 3 of them. That's close enough that if we connect them, the water will kind of even out. There was about 12 feet of difference between Bde-Maka-Ska and Harriet, so that was too much. But he decides, you know what, we can connect these 3 lakes at least. And so the linking of the lakes finally happens in 1911. It's this huge, they throw a parade, there's a huge civic party, there's a boat parade, and you can still canoe and kayak and go between these lakes, and it's wonderful. It's not steam heated, but we can't have everything. Now, speaking of newspapers, and meanwhile in St. Paul, the thing to understand is These cities are exploding in population, both Minneapolis and St. Paul. But to take St. Paul as an example, in 1849, St. Paul had under 400 residents. By 1850, that's 1 year later, it had around 1,000 residents. By 1860, 10 years later, it had 12,000 residents. By 1870, it had 70,000 residents. Now, sort of most explosive of all, between 1880, that's another, in 1880, there's 80,750 residents. In 1886, 6 years later, 120,000 people. These cities are exploding rapidly, and these two graphics here come from the St. Paul Globe, which decided to have a little piece predicting the future of St. Paul. They're saying, boy, at this rate, we're going to be the world's biggest metropolis in a few decades. And what will we look like in the far-off year of 1919? Why did they pick that year? I have no idea. But 1919, this is what they hoped the city would look like. Now, we can laugh, but some of this is actually kind of prescient. Here we have a balloon to New York, a balloon to Washington. This is to London. Now, hot air balloons didn't end up being the preferred method of air travel, but we do have an international airport. There's, these elevated train lines. We do have trains, not elevated. There's pneumatic tubes, so okay, that didn't happen. There's all sorts of other crazy stuff going on here. But the point is, we had such high hopes. Not only that, we had a chip on our shoulder because as much as Minneapolis and St. Paul were expanding, Chicago was expanding faster, and we resented it. And so there was this sort of obsession with, we can outpace Chicago. In fact, this same article, they said, it's not a dream, but a reality that by 1910, St. Paul will not only equal Chicago in size and importance, but surpass it. And we get this lovely graphic of King St. Paul with our humble vassal, Chicago, pledging allegiance. That didn't happen. Now, going back to that previous slide, you'll notice a lot of what they're thinking about here has to do with transit. And there's a number of reasons for this, but one thing is, as cities are getting bigger, it's just getting harder to get from one side of the city to another. It used to be a time where, if your work was on the other side of town, that's okay. That's like a 5-block walk. But now, people are getting farther away from their jobs, especially since in the United States, a sort of world-changing shift in urban development is happening, in which, for the first time, the wealthier citizens are moving to the outskirts of town. Until the 19th century, in pretty much every city in world history, the wealthy people wanted to live right at the heart of things, in the center of town where the action is. And the poorer you were, the further out you were. The slums were always located on the outsides of cities. But that starts to flip in the 19th century. Wealthy people want space. They want that nice yard. They want that Kentucky bluegrass. They move to the outskirts. But as they're getting farther and farther from the center of the town, they're worried about, how do I get around? Also, they're worried about congestion. And by congestion, I'm talking pedestrian congestion, not the kind of traffic you might have sat in combing your way through the wild traffic, but the kind of, think the Minnesota State Fair, like walking around in the Minnesota State Fair every day, that's a dense urban environment. So people are thinking of different methods of transportation. Streetcars are the big one, but are horse-drawn streetcars going to be the way, or should we switch to something else? In the 1880s, Thomas Lowry in Minneapolis starts building a huge steam plant to have cable cars. The steam plant will run steam engines, which will turn big wheels, which will run cables under the ground, and just like in San Francisco, the cable car will grip it and ride up the hill. They build a test stretch on Lowry Hill, and the ice messes with it in the winter. This is going to become a theme of Minnesota. So they decide to go with electric rail cars instead. But there's one proposed method of transportation that got people excited over and over again from the 1880s on through the 1970s, and that is
monorail. What's it called? Monorail. That's right, monorail. 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 Monorail.
So, monorails captured the public imagination first in the 1880s. Now, what's the advantage of a monorail? Well, there's only one rail. No, but what it basically amounts to is a slightly smaller footprint, and that was the real advantage. There are ways, and the early monorails were all suspension monorails, so instead of sitting on top of the rail, it's hanging below it. But the idea is, instead of having to build this big platform to build an elevated rail train, like you were starting to have in Chicago and New York, you would just have these little poles and one track from it, and therefore the monorail can kind of go everywhere without having to bulldoze buildings and clear massive amounts of the city to put it in place. And both St. Paul and Minneapolis in the 1880s are looking into building monorails, even though no city in the world has a monorail yet. This is a brand new technology, and both cities are wanting to be on the cutting edge. And in St. Paul, there is a group that decides to really take off with this. This is actually a monorail that they built in South St. Paul. They built a 12,000-foot test track of it. It is in current South St. Paul, running up and down Bryant Avenue. So it goes from Concord, which is down by the river, running up the bluff to the top of the bluff. And this was meant to be just the start of a line. They were so confident if we build it, everyone will see how awesome this is, and we will get a contract with both St. Paul and Minneapolis to continue a monorail. Oh. Did that not? There we go. So that's what they built. This was the Enos Electric Railway Company, formed by Arthur E. Clarke and other South St. Paul businessmen. And again, their plan is we'll build it and then the city will buy us out. It was built in a little planned community that at that time was called South Park, but is now part of South St. Paul. And I've lost my cursor again. But you can see it. Now you can, what is going on with this? Sorry. That's good. There we go. Yeah, so their design is based on experiments done in New Jersey, and had St. Paul and Minneapolis bit, this would have been the first urban monorail system in the world. But they didn't, and these guys lost all their money. They had invested $2 million. That's roughly the equivalent of $40 million today. They lost their shirts big time. Now, a city that did build it, beginning in 1898, this exact same system was eventually built in Wuppertal, Germany. It's there still today. It's known as the Wuppertal Schwebebahn. And I have a video from 1902, but it's still flying today, but I love old videos. This is what we could have had. And the original proposal was to go through both downtowns, but to basically follow the route of the river. So as you can see here, this case, it's suspended over the street. And as you'll see in a moment, it'll actually go over the river. And that's exactly what they wanted to do here in St. Paul and Minneapolis. They wanted a central route that would go all along the Mississippi up over the St. Anthony Falls, and there'd be bridges coming up to it so workers could get off and on both sides of the city. And again, you can still ride this. It gets a daily ridership of 86,000 people in 2022. Just look at that. We could have had this. It would have cost a lot of money and probably wasn't needed. So that's why it didn't happen. But it would have been really neat, and it would have been the first in the world. But instead, Wuppertal, Germany gets the honors there. If you look up Wuppertal Schwebebahn on YouTube, you can find lots of videos of that. Okay, hopefully this is the last time I'll have to switch back and forth. There's another picture. Yes, and there is a historic marker to this, located at 17th Street and Bryant in South St. Paul. So not many historic markers to things that never happened, but here we go. Now, this sort of talk about new transportation systems, this is part of a larger movement that's really the birth of what today we call urban planning. Now today, you can get your graduate degree in city planning. It is a professionalized industry. There was no such thing. There was no such thing as a professional city planner. These were all sort of, local businessmen and leaders that just thought they had a bright idea and often thought they had a good idea of how to make money. But one thing everyone agrees on in the late 19th century is something has to be done about cities, because they are expanding fast, and with expanding cities you have things like sanitation issues. So in many ways the first urban planning efforts are putting in sewers, because cities stink. And after sewers, we're starting to think about housing. People are so crowded, it's a health risk, diseases spread quickly. We're thinking about transportation, but all around the world as cities are growing, there are these sort of big heroic efforts to try to redo cities. And of course, Europe is leading the way because their cities have been around longer than ours. Now, I should say, in terms of development that affects the United States. Now, there's a whole separate history of urban development in China and India and Africa. There are cities all around the world, but for urban planners in the United States, they're only looking at Europe. So Europe and America is kind of this isolated little world in the worldview of the people who are making planning decisions in the Twin Cities. But in cities like London and Berlin and Paris, there are massive urban renovation efforts happening, and this inspires cities in the United States. And in 1909, a group of Minneapolis businessmen decide it's time Minneapolis really gets serious. We straightened the roads, we renamed them, that's not enough. We need to totally redo Minneapolis. Now this starts at a gathering of Minneapolis businessmen in 1909. There was a local steel magnate, Louis Gillette. He'd just been to South America and visited Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro, two cities that had both just been sort of replatted with these grand European-style boulevards. And he thought, that's great, we should do that. And then other people at this meal bring up the fact that actually Chicago has just come up with this amazing plan to redo Chicago. We should copy them. So one of the guys at this dinner, Wallace G. Nye, who was head of the Commercial Club of Minneapolis, he organizes a group of 45 men as what he called the Committee on Civic Improvements. And their whole task was to form another committee, and that's pretty typical of urban planning. So what they do is they elect an 11-member civic commission. Now these guys have no legal authority or official role. They're not actually part of the city government. They're just concerned businessmen that decide they're going to develop a plan for Minneapolis. And here are the 11 men, and this just gives you an idea of the kind of interests that are at stake here. The chairman was a guy named William Hood Dunwoody, who was part of the flour business. There was a guy named Russell M. Bennett. He'd made a fortune in iron ore. Another flour magnate, Henry F. Douglas, Louis S. Gillette, who was in steel and construction, John De Latre, who was in lumber, Martin B. Kuhn was a local judge, Albert L. Carpenter was in lumber, Frederick W. Clifford was head of the Cream of Wheat Company, Jacob D. Holterman owned a couple department stores. There was a lawyer, Edward C. Gale, and they invited one token tradesman along who happened to be head of the Trades and Labor Assembly, John Walquist. He was only part of this for a month because at their first meeting he said, so guys, I'm going to let you know, anything we approve, I'm going to insist it's union labor that does it. And they were like, get out of here. And he's like, you can't kick me out, I resign. So that was the end of that. But what these guys are really inspired by is something that has come to be called the City Beautiful movement. This is, again, taking off first in cities like Rome and Paris and Berlin and London. This is the era when these increasingly crowded European cities, this is the era of imperialism and of nationalism. And as you have growing empires, they're getting self-conscious about how crowded and dingy and smelly and full of poor people their cities are. So they think, let's bulldoze the slums, let's create these big, huge, broad avenues, we'll erect lots of statues. So this is when like Trafalgar Square and Piccadilly Circus are going up in London. This is when the Arc de Triomphe is being built in Paris. This is when the Brandenburg Gate and the Unter den Linden in Berlin are going up. These are sort of celebrations of empire. They're meant to instill civic pride. They also are designed so that we can't have another 1848, which was when there were attempted revolutions all across Europe, and the revolutionaries took advantage of crowded, narrow streets by forming these barricades that were very hard to get through. So this was sort of a public safety measure. If we have these big, wide avenues, Europeans thought, then we can't have another attempted revolution. Meanwhile, we'll make peons to democracy by having these temples of civic engagement, and to do that, all we have to do is just like kick a lot of people out of their homes to build these great broad avenues. But here's a picture of Paris. This is when Paris starts to look like this instead of a crowded medieval city. And in America, people like those 11 guys, or at least 10 out of the 11, thought this was great, we should do this here. And in fact, unlike having to rebuild a city that's been around for centuries, our cities have been only around a few decades. We can get the drop on this. But then this really takes off in the United States in 1893 when Chicago hosts what are called the World's Columbian Exposition, a World's Fair in Chicago. And they build what comes to be called the White City. This is a brand new construction on what was previously swampland and reclaimed land from Lake Michigan on the south side of Chicago. And everyone's just amazed. It was all designed in this sort of neoclassical style with a lot of Greek and Roman elements. Again, this is the kind of era of nationalism and imperialism, and they're all thinking, boy, Rome was great. We could be the new Rome. Let's erect Roman statues all over the place, and it'll instill civic pride and also prevent revolution. And so this city really impresses people. It was made in just a few months. And the architect, Daniel Burnham, he's immediately tasked by several cities to start redesigning their cities. And his most ambitious plan comes in 1909 when Daniel H. Burnham and Edward Bennett come up with the Plan of Chicago. And most of this plan ends up happening, to Chicago's credit. Their big plan, they were going to widen Michigan Avenue. That ends up happening. If you've been to Chicago, you know how important Michigan Avenue is. Then they were going to bulldoze everything that was on the lake, because the lakefront was all industry. Now it's almost all park. And that was their big idea, is that we'll have this amazing civic area. Today, the city of Chicago has 29 miles of shoreline, and 25 of those miles are parkland. It is rather incredible. And Minneapolis thinks this is just great, and so they hire the same two guys to come up with a plan for Minneapolis. And so they hire Edward Bennett and Daniel Burnham. Now, they spend the next 10 years working on this, and by they I mean Edward Bennett, because Daniel Burnham dies in 1912. Eventually, Edward Bennett ends up as the sole credited guy in this, but Burnham and Bennett were in it together. They start the 376-page book, and it's this like huge coffee table book with fold-out maps. You can find it at the library. There's also on Google Books, but you don't get the fold-out maps. But they start it with a quote from Daniel Burnham that really announced their intentions. Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans. Aim high in hope and work, remembering that a noble logical diagram once recorded will never die, but long after we are gone will be a living thing, asserting itself with ever-growing insistency. Remember that our sons and grandsons are going to do things that would stagger us. Let your watchword be order and your beacon beauty. And so they really took those words to heart. They made no little plans. They were going to out-Paris Paris and just totally redo Minneapolis. Their big innovation, they wanted these sort of broad arterial roads. You can see these diagonal roads. So it's not just a grid, but we've got these diagonal roads. Those were each going to be 250 feet wide, and they wanted to widen every single other road to at least 125, 175 was their preferred. So that's much wider than currently. The average road in Minneapolis at that time was 75 feet. So they want to massively widen things, and where you'll have intersections, they were all about traffic circles, which Americans are still getting used to, but the planners of Minneapolis thought this would just be great. And they also hated the idea that any building should ever be larger than 9 stories. They wanted to ban universally anything above 9 stories because they were worried about the city getting too dense. That was their solution to urban congestion, is not only banning tall buildings, but banning apartments. And they wanted, all the buildings to be designed in this thing. There'd be, of course, obelisks and statues and all the sorts of European and ancient Roman style things that were fashionable as part of the City Beautiful movement. They gave this warning: it may be a grave mistake if this advice is not acted on now. The region may be infested by skyscrapers, and widening in the future will therefore be a practical impossibility. And this is filled with hundreds of illustrations, including these beautiful watercolors. They wanted to build a bunch of bridges. They wanted to reclaim the waterfront from industry. And this is interesting because it's a bunch of industrialists who are writing this plan, or funding it at least. But their idea was, we'll push industry back and hide it behind beautiful buildings and have a bunch of parks right along the riverfront. And right in the center, there was going to be what they called a civic plaza. And this is heading up to it. And there was also, they wanted to bring all of the different railroads together into one big railroad station instead of having a separate Milwaukee Depot and Great Northern Depot and Northern Pacific Depot, just one big depot. And this is what it was going to look like. Here is a sketch of the Civic Plaza. Again, they're really leaning into that Romanesque, neoclassical thing. And they also wanted the centerpiece to lead up to cultural institutions, including the Museum of Fine Arts. Now, this ends up happening, though not quite on the scale. Today, you'll know it as the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And the ball begins rolling. Even before they finish their plan, they start building it. It actually opens in 1915. And the plan was to expand it, and it was going to be the centerpiece of the new Minneapolis plan. It was going to be publicly funded by taxes and free forever, and it still is, and that's a credit to them. This is their original model of what they wanted to build. They ended up building kind of this front part. Now, there's other additions that have happened since then, but they never built all this. But that was the original plan for the art museum. And when it opened in 1915, there was one gallery full of James J. Hill's artwork, another gallery full of other loaners, and then one gallery full of all the plans of Minneapolis, because they wanted people to pass a referendum to make this happen. Here's what they suggested for the riverfront. This is actually a photo of Algiers, but they thought this kind of development where you've got parks and roads and causeways, and then we'll push the flour mills back behind that. So here's how the milling district would look if they had their way. So there's still, some grain elevators and flour mills in there, but we've prettied it up. They also wanted to build locks and dams and make the river navigable. And actually, they imagined a huge public waterway terminal at Minneapolis. Nicollet Island, they had some of the most interesting plans. They wanted to build a combination sports stadium and what they call aeroplane field. So it could have sports games, and then also planes could land there, which tells you something about the state of aviation at the time. Now, they had no power to do any of this. They needed the public to fund this. And so they do a lot of lobbying, and they get their way to start. In 1919, the state legislature passes an act that would enable the formation of an official city planning committee. It's established in 1919, and a few things do happen. The Minneapolis Institute of Arts is the most prominent one. They clear what had become sort of the densest slum at what's called the Gateway District, right at the edge of Hennepin Avenue by the bridge, and they build a big park there. The Great Northern Depot gets partially committed, though the other railroads weren't on board with building a big new depot. They plant trees all over the city. That was one of the suggestions. And they do introduce locks and dams eventually in the 1960s. Also, playgrounds happen, and that was one of the more forward thinkings of this. These huge 250-foot avenues, in the middle they wanted what were called playways, which was like a strip of grass, but there'd be playgrounds built. And at this point, there's a lot of parks in Minneapolis, but there's not what we would call a playground. It's just like an open space. And they were aimed at adults, not kids. They were thinking of kids and thinking kids need a place to play. And the park board takes up this recommendation and says, okay, we can't have the playways, but we can put a playground in all of our parks. And that starts to get built. So some things did happen, but this never quite came to be. We could have been Venice, we could have been Paris, instead we're Minneapolis. Now, to fast forward a few decades, the City Beautiful movement comes to a crashing halt in the 1910s for a number of reasons. One of them is World War I. And suddenly wanting to copy these old imperial European powers just is less cool, because Europe has spent 4 years destroying itself. Not only that, but America is doing just fine without these sorts of sweeping things, but also they're really expensive, and people realize this. So Chicago did their plan. Most of the other cities that had big plans, and pretty much every city had something like this, they don't happen. But then in the 1930s, a series of planning decisions starts to basically empty out cities. And I would emphasize that it is decisions that unintentionally cause this to happen. But during the Great Depression, as the construction industry and pretty much everything else is struggling, the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration programs, they try to get the economy going by funding construction, offering mortgage loans, offering loans to repair things. But all of these loans, they prioritized new construction over old construction. They prioritized buying up land on the outskirts of town rather than renovating urban districts. They prioritized building brand new things rather than renovating old structures. And these start to spur suburban development. And then this really accelerates after World War II. This is also, of course, when cars are taken off. One fascinating thing about the plan of Minneapolis, they don't imagine cars will ever amount for more than 1% of the city's traffic. They're imagining a pedestrian city. They're thinking streetcars will be just fine, otherwise we're walking. They are thinking of cars as just kind of something that rich people use to get to their, exurban country homes. Cars after 1908, when Henry Ford introduces the modern assembly line and the Model T, and then really after 1920, people start buying cars. And America has another first. We were the first country to start moving wealthier people to the outskirts of town. Now we're the first country to start building towns with cars specifically in mind, rather than just adapting our cities to cars. And after World War II, suburbs are expanding and downtowns are shriveling, and places like Dayton's, who is a huge anchor department store in downtown Minneapolis, they're struggling and they're thinking, maybe the suburbs are the future. And they start funding suburban shopping centers. And this is where we come to the building of Southdale in Edina, Minnesota, which is, it's often claimed to be the first shopping mall. And whenever you claim that, someone says, well, what about Northland in Detroit? Or what about this in Philadelphia? Or what about, there's lots of potential claimants. I will say it very carefully then. It is the first fully enclosed, automobile-oriented, climate-controlled, regional shopping mall. If you take away any one of those qualifiers, there's another one that can make the case. But when we think today of a shopping mall, we think of something very much like Southdale, and it really set the trend. So, go us. But to talk about Southdale, we have to talk about a very interesting fellow named Victor Gruen. Now, Victor Gruen was born around the turn of the 20th century in Vienna. He was, his parents were artists, and he grew up, he eventually went to art school. Actually, he got into the school that kicked Hitler out. He was very much in the arts and philosophy crowd. And Vienna was one of those classic European cities with these huge broad boulevards and piazzas and plazas that had been made in the late 19th century. And it was just a hotbed of artistic culture and intellectualism. You could sit around and listen to Strauss waltzes and debate psychoanalysis and all that. He's very much a part of that scene. And then in 1938, the Nazis take over. And he is everything the Nazis hate. He is Jewish, he is a socialist, he is very left-leaning, he's an intellectual, he's an artist, he's got to get out of there. So some of his theater friends who are good at making costuming, they make a mock SS uniform that's good enough to fool actual Nazis, and he escapes disguised as an SS trooper and comes to America, arriving in 1939 in New York City with speaking no English and only $8. But he does have architectural training, and he eventually makes quite a name for himself designing storefronts on Fifth Avenue. Now, this guy's a committed socialist. He actually had reservations. He believed in a market economy, but was not a huge fan of rampant American-style consumerism. But he's got to make a living, and Fifth Avenue stores pay really well. So he's designing Fifth Avenue stores. Eventually he starts designing shopping centers, but it's when the Dayton Corporation approaches him in 1952 that he really gets excited, because he still has some of that lingering spirit of the City Beautiful movement, and part of that spirit, it's very much part of that turn of the century movement that historians call the progressive era, basically that idea that we can make big sweeping decisions, policy decisions that will reform society. It's an era of reform. And there's very much this assumption that if you build the landscape right, that will be a form of social engineering. And everything we don't like about society, by fixing the physical landscape, we can fix society itself. And Victor Gruen carries on that spirit, but in a very mid-20th century post-war way. He wants to push back against individualism. He wants to push back against what he sees as the loss of community. Basically, he wants Vienna back. He wants to sit around a cafe and debate psychoanalysis and listen to waltzes and sip espresso and have a wonderful sense of community. And he thinks the Dayton Corporation is going to provide him with that, because they said, we've bought tons of land in Edina and we don't know what to do with it. We hear you're an idea guy. And this is what he suggests. Now, I've been unable to find many of his original plans. This is probably as close as we'll get. This is probably closer to what actually happened than what he initially suggested. Because what he initially suggested was, we'll have a planned community. We're going to have department stores and other merchants in the middle, but we're going to have an indoor arcade and galleria and gathering spaces. But in between every store, there's going to be a school. There's going to be a library. There's going to be a church. There's going to be people's houses. There's going to be apartment buildings. And all of the parking will be underground, so we don't see any cars, but we're going to encourage an entire pedestrian city. So even if people drive here and have to drive elsewhere, when they're in our city, they will only walk. And they'll love walking, because I know it's cold in Minnesota. It's all going to be indoors. It'll be okay. This is a slightly later version of that plan, but they're still thinking in that way. This will be the central marketplace. Here's, of course, parking lots. But these were to be high-density housing, municipal buildings, schools, police and fire, all that, and then lower-density housing. All of this land was owned by the Dayton Company. It's just cornfields at this time, and they bought out the farmers that owned it. And he really thinks this is going to create a new style of living. It's going to be this sort of utopian community. Here's another drawing I was able to find. And you can see this is a little different than what we ended up. Here's the parking underground, but also on the roof. But in the middle, we've got stores, but also office buildings, a motor hotel, a railroad station. And this is what they build. It's the modern shopping mall. It's incredibly innovative for its time, though. It's hard to innovate. It's hard to emphasize how much this really impressed people in 1956, because you go inside and you could walk around, you could hang out. There were these cafes. And early Southdale was closer to Victor Gruen's dream than Southdale or most malls today. There was a post office. There was a police department. There was planned to be a library, though they eventually ended up building a library across the street, and it's a great library. There was a Red Owl grocery, but it was mostly just stores. But people could walk around. This did change American shopping forever, and immediately shopping malls start going up all around the country, and Victor Gruen is in demand. And he's really dismayed about this, because he said, well, this was just supposed to be phase one. I mean, I get that this is where the funding came from, but this was supposed to be the start of an anti-consumerist rebirth of community in America, not the shopping mall. And in 1978, he's disgusted. He goes back to Vienna. He says in a speech, quote, "I refuse to pay alimony for those bastard developments." He basically disowns the shopping mall. And in fact, most tragically of all, he goes to visit his childhood home. It's been bulldozed to build an American-style shopping mall in Vienna. So poor Victor Gruen. Now, I'm going to sort of rapidly move through the next couple things. The idea that we need transportation hasn't gone away, though. For the most part, American planners, they've just gone all in on the automobile. Again, look at that. Look at that. What's notable about Southdale? Parking lots. And Southdale, by the way, they also invented that idea that, like, oh, we're in the squirrel lot, like labeling parking lots because there's so many of them. So Victor Gruen invented that. But in the 1970s, cities are getting even more dilapidated. Again, there's so much federal funding. Now in the case of federal highway bills, there are policy decisions that are emptying out cities. But they think, well, if policy caused this problem, policy can fix it. What we really need is a people mover. And that's what they called it. Now, the phrase "people mover" was invented by an urban designer you may have heard of, and I'll show a clip from one of his promotional films for a thing that he really wanted to build, and this was influenced by
A network
Victor
of
Gruen.
transportation systems radiate from the central hub. carrying people to and from the heart of the city. These transportation systems circulate to and through 4 primary spheres of activity surrounding the central core. First, the area of business and commerce. Next, the high-density apartment housing. Then the broad greenbelt and recreation lands. And finally, the low-density neighborhood residential streets. And now here again is Walt Disney.
I believe we can build a community that more people will talk about and come to look at than any other area in the world. And with your cooperation, I'm sure this experimental prototype community of tomorrow can influence the future of city living for generations to come.
So that's urban planner Walt Disney. He recorded this film 1 week before he died of lung cancer, and he never lived to see his vision happen. They eventually did build Epcot, as it's called, but it's a theme park, not what Disney hoped. Disney really wanted Victor Gruen to make it. But by this point, Victor Gruen was disgusted with American development and refused to participate. But that little film of Disney's I showed is actually very much the kind of thing Gruen was thinking of. Yes, shopping's at the center, but then there's housing, there's parks, there's all the rest. And how are we going to get people around? We're going to return to the pedestrian city. And since it's still kind of big, we'll have what Walt Disney creatively called, famous creative Walt Disney came up with the amazing name People Mover, and it's stuck. And by the 1970s, everyone's all in on people movers. Every city is looking into the possibility of people movers. Now, I know what you're thinking. Isn't that just a monorail by another name? Yes, but what's cool about people movers is instead of a train, they're individual little pods. And these were to be computer controlled, and you'd get into your own personal little pod and not have to talk to any other strangers or anything else, and it would zoom wherever you want. You'd push a button and the computer would route it. Now, the computers that they're using to do this, they're using like reels of magnetic tape, which is a step up from punch cards, but still, there's devils in the detail. They have to figure it out. But this is very much appealing to that American sense of individualism. The closest we can really get on board for a truly mass transit system is, can I have my own mass transit system? And this idea still hasn't gone away with, tunnels with Teslas driving you and stuff. But both St. Paul and Minneapolis are seriously looking into People Mover, but St. Paul goes all in. Here's another potential People Mover pod. Here's the proposed route for the first line of People Movers through St. Paul. They built an adorable little model. And this would spur all sorts of urban development, it was hoped. And interestingly, so here's the Selby Tunnel. They thought, if we have people movers, we can close all the streets in downtown and it'll become a pedestrian downtown again. So here's a proposal for what Wabasha Street would look like if it wasn't a street. A couple of these areas did actually happen. Between Wabasha and St. Peter, they closed 6th Street. And this is actually pretty close to what happened, except for the People Mover. Now, one last thing I'll close with, another sort of part of thinking of this era is the idea of a new town in town. So Victor Gruen thought, we can get Dayton's to fund my new town on the outskirts of town. Didn't end up happening. Well, now we have federal money. And this starts with the creation in 1965 of the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. In the next few years, Congress passes 3 new communities programs, and the important one, 1968, called Title VII, appropriates up to $500 million for cities to build new developments in existing towns that will be self-contained units. And Minneapolis thinks Cedar Riverside is perfect because we've just bounded it in by freeways and it's falling apart and full of old buildings. And so we can just clear all those old buildings and it'll be the perfect spot for us to get $500 million from the federal government. And this is happening by developers Gloria Segal and her husband Martin, as well as advice from University of Minnesota School of Business Administration head Keith Heller. And they hire an architect called Ralph Rapson. And they start designing this city, which is supposed to have up to 33,000 people by 1975. Here's another drawing of the Cedar Riverside new community. Now, it's going to be very similar to what you saw with Gruen's design for Southdale, except there won't be any shopping mall part of it. There will be little stores and things, but they're really emphasizing the community aspect. They wanted it to be mixed income, ethnically diverse, different apartments are different sizes, and it was all pedestrian-oriented around what they called a centrum, this sort of central corridor, and then there'd be different developments off to the sides here. And they're really investigating all sorts of cutting-edge stuff. They were going to hook every single apartment up to a cable TV that was interactive so that you could order food through the cable TV. You could check in with a doctor for a remote doctor's visit. They're sort of trying to build the internet before the internet, but via cable at Cedar Riverside. And all things seem to be going well. They start building it in 1972. This is phase 1. It ends up being phase final, but they did build phase 1. Now, they encounter immediately a lot of resistance from the people who are living in Cedar Riverside. Now, who's living in Cedar Riverside? It's an incredibly diverse area, but if I were to generalize, hippies. In the 1960s, the University of Minnesota had expanded to the West Bank, and these were cheap, falling apart old Victorian homes, perfect for student living, but it becomes really the thriving hub of the counterculture. And this is a very politically charged counterculture. This is the era of the Vietnam War, of the civil rights movement, of the gay rights movement, the women's movement. People are used to organizing as chill and relaxed as they might be at other times. And they don't like being told that because of eminent domain and a big developer who's getting money from the federal government, you have to leave. So they start organizing. And there are local lawyers and community organizers that start slowing things down with lawsuits. Meanwhile, there's more active interference. There's a lot of political radicals and self-identified anarchists living in Cedar Riverside, and they start sabotaging construction equipment. They start holding rallies. They start signing everyone up in what they called a tenants union, and they all start refusing to pay rent to their landlords. And there's a bunch of big protests, and the Minneapolis Police Department comes in riot gear and starts tear gassing and beating people, as they are wont to do. And this is like a huge thing, but long story short, it totally gums up the works of the planned Riverside community. And in 1979, they abandoned it. In 1985, the corporation that was sort of funding this goes into receivership. And their biggest dreams never happened. But these initial towers did get built, and they actually were pretty affordable and interesting in modern homes. And by the 1990s, they become really the center of the Somali community. They start to become largely settled with recent immigrants from Somalia and other East African nations. And there is kind of a thriving community here, but not in the same way that the planners imagined. Now, I'm going to end my story there, both because it's about that time, but also because there's so many other things I could have talked about here, but I wanted to focus on kind of the biggest, most bravura, brash planning proposals. And that era of like huge scale thinking, big ideas, as Daniel Burnham would say, that starts to end in the late 70s. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is just backlash against all the failed plans that have been happening for a century or more. But also backlash against government in general. The political winds are shifting. Ronald Reagan is inaugurated in 1980. In his first speech, he says, government is not the solution to problems, government is the problem. And while there are plenty of people that disagreed with him, he did speak for a lot of people and a sort of prevailing attitude among many people at that time. And so this idea that we're going to totally civically engineer society through big urban planning, that just becomes very unpopular starting in the 1980s. But also things like the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the funding goes away from that because of political decisions being made at the federal level, also similar things happening at the state and local level. So urban planning decisions continue to happen. By now, it is an official discipline. There are urban planners officially appointed to every city, but they're dealing with smaller scale things. And so most proposals over the years, they've been private developers proposing to do specific things with their little chunk of land that they own, rather than these big sort of citywide sweeping proposals. So the late 1970s felt like a decent place to end this, because it is in some ways the close of an era. But in closing, what I would say is just emphasize what it said at the beginning. In history, there's always alternatives. Things always could have gone a different way, but of course we're living history. One takeaway that I want you to have, we've looked at some choices that didn't happen, but as you go around your cities, just remember the way the city is the result of people making choices. Sometimes there's unintended consequences, sometimes there's unfulfilled dreams, but still, things didn't just sort of happen. They are the way they are because people decided that they should be a certain way. And you are all people, you can all make decisions, and you can have a role in the future of cities today, whatever that future might be. There's always possibilities. Don't just slide into a default of things just are the way they are, because that's how it is. So I want to thank you for coming out here again, and now's the best part of the presentation for me, because I don't have to prepare anything. I will take any questions. Way in the back there, thank you. Yeah.
Is this working? We all had a good laugh about the idea of boats being taken up a hill on a rail system. I challenge you to check out Kyoto, where exactly such a plan worked.
Oh, really?
Kyoto, Japan.
Oh, I'm excited.
There's a canal from Lake Biwa to Kyoto, and I won't go on and on. You're a smart man, loved biking with you way back in October, whatever. Check out Kyoto.
I will. I'm so glad to hear someone did it, because I think, again, necessary, practical, not really, but cool, yeah, and there's value in that. So thank you for the tip.
As I recall, in about 1965, there was a very comprehensive plan to build a subway system in the Twin Cities. And it looked like it was going to happen, but there was never a shovel that was put in the ground. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so that's one of the things I considered talking about, but just for time I didn't, because it gets to be a kind of repetitive story. In 1913, there's a proposed subway system. They look into it, decide it's not necessary yet, but part of that Minneapolis plan, one of the other ideas behind the really broad boulevards is we'd leave space for a subway because eventually we'll need it. And one thing I didn't mention about that Minneapolis plan, they said by 1930 we will have 1 million people. By 1945 we will have 3 million people. And part of their plan was to grow not just through growing, but by annexing every city around it, including St. Paul. That wasn't going to happen. But anyway, Minneapolis planned on growing, and they thought eventually we will need a subway. So 1913, first subway proposal, but they decide not yet, but we're going to leave room for it. 1931, there's another proposal for a subway. Bad year to propose any sort of thing. The Depression had just set in. They'd spent 6 years working on this proposal, so they didn't know the Depression was around the corner. But that gets nixed. In the 1950s, there's talk of a subway, and then in 1965, as you say, that's the closest we ever got. They look into it, and what killed at that time? The people mover. There was a lot of argument. Basically, the sort of elephant in the room of all of these things is, well, what's it going to cost? Because someone has to pay for it. These things are expensive. And the argument of the people mover over the subway is that it was cheaper to put in a people mover. And then arguments over exactly how the people mover would work and where it would go and who's going to fund it and whether we're going to have trains or little individual pods and whether we can invent the kind of computer that can control that. The people mover just ended up never happening. I believe there was also a movement for a subway in the 1980s. But by that point, Minneapolis's population had actually begun to decline, and that, among other things, kind of probably helped seal the fate of never needing a subway. Subway is kind of one of those things that if you don't have a certain population density, it doesn't make that much sense. There are cities like Rochester, New York, and Buffalo, New York, that had a subway, and it's sealed off and underground, and only daring urban explorers go down there now because the population of the city just isn't enough to support a viable subway system. But yeah, thank you for bringing that up because it is another one of those things. What I would say is monorails, trolleys, subways, and eventually light rail were always sort of being discussed as different options. And the light rail system that we have now and that is currently being expanded, that definitely grew out of some of those same conversations. But like I say, every choice to do something is also a choice not to do something else. For whatever reason, light rail was picked over subways, but the suggestion has never gone away, and it'll probably come back again. Yes?
Did anyone anywhere ever build a people mover?
Yes, Detroit did and Miami did. And the Miami one, I believe, is closed, but you can still ride the one in Detroit. They tried the individual pods thing, and they couldn't get the computer to work. Now it's just a train, basically. But you can still ride it around downtown New York. Now, I should say there's two other places you can ride a people mover. One other place you can ride a people mover, and that is Epcot Center in Walt Disney World. They also didn't end up doing the individual pods, and it's really just, you ride around the theme park. Least popular ride in Epcot, I believe, but it's there and you can read it, and it is called a people ride it, and it's called a people mover. Yes.
So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the current efforts to re-envision Highway 94 in between downtown St. Paul and downtown Minneapolis. There's the Land Bridge and also the Twin Cities Boulevard.
Yeah.
Those are sort of big swing proposals. Do you
are.
think that those are a fluke, or is that a return to the era of accepting of big swing projects?
So historians make terrible predictors of the future. I think we are seeing a return to those sort of big swing projects. How much success it will have, or whether it is more of a fluke, is what I have trouble seeing. But you're absolutely right. So I said that 1970s was kind of the end. There have been other proposals since then. Most of them had to do with the riverfront until pretty recently, redeveloping the riverfront. In fact, in Minneapolis, there was talk of when they closed the Locken Dam, which it turns out was never needed or a good idea, they were going to turn it into this huge water park with like whitewater rafting. And so there were some big plans. But sort of the closest example recently has been the Greenbelt movement, and that started with things like turning a former rail corridor into a bike lane, the Greenway in Minneapolis, but it's expanding to covering over the freeways and having a land bridge that would, start to repair communities that had been very much torn up by the freeways. Now, I didn't talk about freeways much. I think to some extent freeways might be an exception, because I think there's growing recognition that freeways were a choice, and one that actually, for whatever benefits they gave, also came with a real human cost. Another thing I could have mentioned, when they put freeways through, there were all sorts of proposals of where the freeways would go. Most of them were rejected in favor of putting them through the poorest and most heavily African-American neighborhoods. And that was no accident. They were the people who had no political power to complain as much as other demographics of the city did. And things like the Rondo community in St. Paul were just devastated by the building of 94. And so I think because there's growing recognition that a huge civic project, namely the freeways, destroyed communities, it's a little easier sell to say, well, maybe a huge civic project can save the community or restore the community. So freeways and repairing the damage done by freeways might be in a different category. But I don't know. The pendulum, speaking of pendulums, the pendulum in history always swings back and forth. So we may very well be entering another cycle.
Can you say something about the Nicollet Mall in Minneapolis? You've given us a lot of examples of plans where there were 10 ideas and only one happened. Was the mall a standalone, or were there 9 other ideas that fit around it that just never took place?
That's a great question. So the answer is yes, there were lots of other plans of sort of Nicollet Mall style things around the city, but also Nicollet Mall has always had a specifically special place in Minneapolis planning. In fact, that 1856 map I showed, when they drew that, there was only one official street name, and it was Hennepin Avenue. And they created the next name in that map, and that was Nicollet, was the second street named. And that was designed as an arterial boulevard that would intersect with Hennepin right at the bridge, and then Nicollet would extend in another direction. So Nicollet, in some ways, was one of Minneapolis's first planning choices. The idea that we'd have this kind of arterial road, Hennepin being one, Nicollet being the other, and it would spread out in this ever-growing triangle with the city in between, was part of John H. Stevens's initial plan for the city's expansion. But early on, because it was this kind of central junction, Nicollet and Hennepin became this very busy area. It became known as Skid Row, and because it was by sawmills, it was by railroads, it was by industry, it was where a lot of working people lived, but also where a huge transient population tended to live. And so it became the city's first quote-unquote slum clearance. They built the Gateway district, but part of that was thinking, yeah, Nicollet is perfect for becoming our sort of Parisian style, Champs-Élysées sort of boulevard. And so from the early 1900s onward, there was all sorts of talk about Nicollet Avenue. And ultimately, the Nicollet Avenue that we see here is not nearly as grand or as sculpted as many of the proposals, but it is still something rather special. As recently as the 90s, they majorly redid it and decided to make it bus only, so there's not just regular traffic on it. So yeah, the answer is kind of both. There were other sort of avenues that were talked about turning into sort of a commercial district or a central plaza, but Nicollet has always been sort of top on every urban planner's list of there's an opportunity to do something really interesting. Question over here or there? Acoma's got the mic.
Climate change. This is a physical driving force against which we're not going to have a lot of answers. Density is much lower carbon consumption. People who live in dense cities have much, much smaller carbon footprints. And economists all agree, although the public doesn't, that a carbon tax would be the most efficient way of reducing greenhouse gases. And so if we had a carbon tax, I think that would have a profound impact, and someday we'll get smart and introduce it. So what do you say to that?
Speaking completely personally, I think it's a great idea. But you mentioned economists, and I have a bit of a bone to pick with economists as a field, no individuals, because, and I know there's exceptions, but so much of mainstream economic theory is based on an assumption that, as a historian, I think is a faulty assumption. And that assumption is people behave rationally and in their self-interest. And I just see history again and again proving that that isn't the case. Now, of course, economists to some extent know this and they try to take account, but I think intangible cultural factors and wishful thinking and sort of going with the flow of the social environment that you're in makes a bigger impact on people's choices than simple self-interest and the sorts of things that are easier to quantify. But it's hard to build a mathematical model to predict those sorts of things. So economics is based on, modeling and that sort of thing. So, one example as a roundabout way of answering that question, in the 1950s, economists were already saying, just economically, they weren't worried about the environment yet, but economically, it does not make sense to build cities built around the automobile. Like, dense cities just are more efficient in every way. We're saving money by building dense cities. We should build people movers. We should build trains. We should build mass transit. We should build huge apartment buildings. That'll be so much more efficient. That's not what Americans did. They sprawled out because we like our space. We like our cars. Nobody needed a car if we had chosen to design cities as pedestrian cities. We wanted cars. And as soon as Henry Ford figured out a way to use the economy of scale to make cars affordable, people started buying them. A car to Americans, I think, was less a choice they made out of rational self-interest, like this is the most efficient thing for me. They made the choice because it was appealing. and it was appealing for cultural reasons. We have this deeply embedded individualism. Compared to other societies, I think Americans are more individualist than community-centered. Now, of course, there's communities, but again, there's a strong individualism in American culture, and especially the wealthier you get, the more individualistic people get. And that made us want cars. And even when we started thinking maybe we can save our cities with mass transit, we didn't want really mass transit. We wanted our own little people mover pods because we don't like other people. We don't want communities. So I think there's cultural barriers more than other barriers. And I don't know, I think culture takes longer to change. Now, I am hopeful. When I look at like Gen Z kids, I think there's a change coming, but it's going to be a multi-generational change. And as our climate gets more and more out of control, that may help change people's mind quicker. But I think the trends that have allowed American cities to be designed the way they are and have shaped American policies, including things like carbon tax, are these deeply embedded cultural assumptions, and that's the real barrier. So I think if we change, in some ways, I have the opposite view than the City Beautiful movement or the urban planners. Their idea was change the physical environment, you change the culture. I think you need to change the culture first, and then the physical environment starts to reflect that. And how to change the culture, that's a big question, but that's where I'll leave it.
We only have time for one more question. I saw you. It's the last question.
Hello?
Hello.
It was a bit louder than I expected. Sorry. I just wanted to get your... me and my father were originally from Chicagoland area, and Chicago, you discussed that earlier, a bit of their plan for City Beautiful movement.
Yeah.
One thing that I was kind of interested in was that there's not really any, despite there being a lot of suburbs and a bit more spread out, there's not really any commuter rail system, unlike Metro in Chicago. Is there any specific, is it just population density or politics? Because I know about the North Star line, but don't really know about anything else besides that. There's the light rail obviously heading towards Chanhassen and Edina, but what's your thought on that?
Yeah, so that's another thing I could have talked about but didn't, just because I wanted to talk about monorails more. But from the 1880s onward, there's been all sorts of talk of interurban rail systems connecting whole regions. And this is something that obviously on the East Coast they did early on and quite successfully. And Chicago is another example. And that Chicago plan, the loop in downtown, that was part of the plan. And then the other idea that would connect to commuter rail that would go up to Evanston and go up to, all these other cities, that was part of the Burnham plan. And that was one that was, again, to Chicago's credit, they implemented their plan. Minneapolis, we said no thanks. But part of that plan was interurban rail, and they wanted it to be specifically electric interurban rail because they weren't necessarily thinking about the environment for the reasons we are, but smoke is nasty, and anything we can do a way to deal with smoke. And there have been all sorts of proposals connecting basically every city you could think of in Minnesota, and most of them never got off the ground. A few of them started to happen, but I'd say the big difference is politics. Specifically, the interurban rails that happened with a huge infusion of government money, taxpayer money. Depending on the rail system we're talking about, sometimes it's federal, sometimes it's state, sometimes it's local, sometimes it's municipal. Usually it's a mix of all of the above. But in Minnesota, politically, there were bills to sponsor big, interurban rails, and obviously the North Star Line and light rail is one of them. But apart from that, all the other bills just have not been voted. They've failed. So there were several attempts to build lines privately, and they were business failures. Because, for example, so the most prominent one, there was a railroad built in the 1890s between St. Paul and Hastings. And it did okay, but their plan was to expand all the way down to Winona and Red Wing and then go over to Rochester and also go up to Anoka and over to St. Cloud. It was going to be this massive rail system, and the idea was the line to Hastings is just the first line, but They were in debt from day one, and they never climbed out of debt, and they went bankrupt in 1901, and it got absorbed into the Twin Cities Mass Transit, but they weren't interested in expanding too much. Twin Cities Mass Transit, a for-profit company, so it was never economically, and companies maybe do act in self-interest. It was never economically in the self-interest of private rail companies to build that, and there was never the political capital to quite make it happen otherwise.
Thank you. That's the closing. Thank you so much for taking your time to spend here at the History Center, and thank you, Alex. That was great. If you all have any other following questions, you can ask Alex. Right upstairs, we have a small reception, once again, with cookies and lemonade if you want them. And on your way out, you can pick up a survey, and we truly appreciate your feedback for these programs. So thank you once again, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.